The United States is getting ready to celebrate the 250th anniversary of its Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. So I thought it might be fun and interesting to some to maybe do some profiles on some of the Skeltons that helped with that effort. And there are more than one. There are 5 or 6 that directly helped by serving. And then there are several others that indirectly helped and certainly supported the cause. The Skeltons of colonial Virginia were surrounded by people who believed in an independent America. And so the first one that I want to talk about is William Skelton. Now, there were at least 3 William Skeltons that helped with the cause, but this one here is William Skelton that was that ended up moving to Hawkins County, Tennessee, and died there in the 1830s. But let's talk about a little bit of how the process worked. So back then, when you served in the Revolutionary War, I mean, it could have been just for a few weeks or a few months. It wasn't like it is today, where when you volunteered that you served for years at a time. That wasn't the case at all. There were very short services. That's one of the things that made it incredibly difficult and incredibly amazing that the America actually won that war. And then when you stopped serving, they did have a certificate that was issued sometimes, but not all the time. And there are people nowadays that lose birth certificates, marriage certificates, and all that sort of stuff through the fire, just moving, or just living your life. Sometimes you just misplace that stuff. A lot of that stuff was destroyed by fires. The War of 1812, there were a lot of fires in courthouses, so lots of records were destroyed. In the Civil War, lots of records were destroyed. And then there were just natural fires. And back then, it's not like, again, some of them were issued certificates for service, but it's not like today where you get a DD-214 or something similar to that proves your service. So in 1832, Congress passed a motion that they wanted to provide for pensions for any of the Revolutionary War soldiers that served a minimum of 2 months. Again, it's 1832. I mean, the fighting was effectively over in 1781. So we're talking, what is that math, 50-some years later? So lots of things can happen. Like I said, the fires, just life in general. So the process would be that if you were a Revolutionary War soldier and you wanted to apply for a pension, you'd have to go to the local courthouse and make a deposition where you would recite things that needed to be verified, dates and places of birth. Obviously, if you can't verify you were born at a certain time, then you wouldn't have been old enough to serve. Or if you were born, in 1700, it's unlikely that you served in the Revolutionary War in the 1770s. So you would have that. You would in your deposition, you would talk about who you served with, where you were drafted or volunteered from, who your commanding officers were there any other soldiers, where did you march, what battles were you in, what places were you in, did you march from here to here on that date or from place to place, and so and so. And then you would have to get people that would support that testimony. Maybe neighbors, neighbors that would say, yeah, I've known him my whole life, and he was born in such and such a place, such and such a time, and I know that he served. Or you might be able to, if you still had a commanding officer or another person who served and you knew how to get a hold of them, again, you couldn't just go back and bang out an email. So it was a process, but if you give your deposition and get people to testify in support of it, then you can make your application. So that's what William Skelton did in 1833 in Hawkins County. At the time, he would have been 71 years old, so he went and made a deposition. So a lot of the information I'm getting for his service come from that deposition, and I'm looking at my notes here. So, and I want to get this right, because there are dates and places and times and such as that, and people that I want to get right. And I don't want to just do it off memory and maybe get something wrong. So when he made his application, he made it like I said, in 1883, when he was 71 years old. He said for the first time that he went into the service, he volunteered under the immediate command of Captain Samuel Coleman. Remember that name, Coleman. That'll be important later on. But he went into the immediate command of Captain Samuel Coleman in May of 1779. We know from this deposition that he was born, where is his date of birth on here? 1762. So he was just barely 17. Went under the immediate command of Captain Samuel Coleman in the county of Caroline County, that's in Virginia, in the last of April or 1st of May in 1779. Again, he was born in March of 1762, according to this deposition, so he was barely 17 years old. In this first service, he marched from Caroline County to Williamsburg, at which point he was transferred to General Scott, and then at Williamsburg, he was discharged after serving 2 months. So again, he only served a couple months. And then after that, he said he returned home a distance of 80 miles. I know that was true because I went to Google Maps, and sure enough, it's about 80 miles. He knew it was 80 miles because he knew it was 80 miles and he made the trip. So he was discharged after a couple months, so it would have been like July roughly of 1779. 1781, he was actually called into service. He was drafted in 1781. This would have been for his second tour. And if they followed the rules of the time, I'll scroll down another page. So, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So that was in 1781. He's drafted from the county of Amherst, under the command of Captain James Barnett and then Colonel Charles Dabney. They marched to Richmond and then to Williamsburg and then to Yorktown. And then at Yorktown they were put under the command of General Nelson and Captain Luckers. After that they marched to Hampton, then to a halfway house for the winter, and then marched from York to another halfway house in Williamsburg. And from Williamsburg, he was discharged for the second time in the first part of April 1781, having served an additional 3 months. So he's up to 5 months of service right now. To get the pension, you had to have served at least 2. So his first tour would have qualified him for the pension. And then for the third time, towards the last half of April or May of 1781, so again, literally just a few weeks after getting back from his second tour, he substituted for Hugh McAnally. You could do that back then. You could get somebody to substitute for you. And so here's what I was talking about earlier. If they followed the rule of the time, for Hugh McAnally to get a substitute would mean that Hugh McAnally was a Quaker. And had a conscientious objection. I don't think that's what they called it back then, but that's what we would have called it now. So, and again, the McAnallys, that's another name that will surface later on. So that's his third tour of duty. They marched to Richmond and kept on constant march and duty, sometimes under the Marquis de Lafayette. Now that's a big name in Revolutionary War. Marquis was General Washington's right-hand man. He was French, came over from France to help with the war, and he was absolutely critical. In fact, we've been to Mount Vernon, Washington's home, and when we were there 30 years ago, there was actually a key hanging up in Mount Vernon that was a key to the Bastille in France, and that was a present that the Marquis had given to George Washington. So marching under the Marquis, he's a rock star. The last command was General William Campbell, where William stayed until the capture of Lord Cornwallis. Didn't say that he fought in that battle, but he was there, so who knows. So during the entire time of all three of these services, the only time William got paid was in the first month And that was out of the pocket of Samuel Coleman. So William Skelton didn't get paid by the United States or by Washington or anybody. The only salary he got for all of his service and all of his effort in marching was 1 month that was paid out of the pocket of Samuel Coleman. And so then after that, he was discharged. That was the end of his 3 services. And then he says in his application that in 1797, they moved from Amherst County, that's in Virginia, to Hawkins County, Tennessee. And Hawkins County, Tennessee had just become Hawkins County, Tennessee. Prior to that, it had been part of North Carolina. So 2 of the witnesses to William's deposition, one of them was John Skelton, who mentioned that he was his brother. So now we know that William Skelton had a brother named John Skelton, who was younger, and also a friend named Margaret Peggy Craven, Craven, who was a neighbor of theirs back in Virginia, in Caroline County. Some people believe that Margaret might have been their sister. There's no mention of that. Doesn't mean she couldn't have been. She may very well have been. I haven't done any real research on that. So maybe Margaret was a sister, but we don't know. At any rate, they were certainly lifelong friends. I mean, they were neighbors back in Caroline County when they were born, and now they're neighbors in Hawkins County, Tennessee, 50 years later. So that's a very distinguished service. 3 tours of duty, saw a lot of, been to a lot of famous places, marched under some famous people. Anybody who wants to become a member of a legacy organization using William, that's a layup, absolute layup. It's not always that easy to prove their service, but in this case here, that's an absolute layup. So if you can trace your name back to William Skelton from Hawkins County, you can absolutely get into any of the legacy organizations like Sons of the American Revolution, Daughters of the American Revolution, things like that. So who was William Skelton, the Revolutionary War Patriot? That takes a little bit of digging. Again, we know from his application that he was born in 1762, and I'm looking at my notes again here, in Caroline County. We know from that application that he had a brother named John, and John's wife, we know, was Elizabeth. We know that because in 1843, William wrote his will in 1843, and in that he talks about his brother John and his wife Elizabeth. He talks about his grandson, William Christian, but he also talks about his brother James. That's critical, all right? So we know that there were William, John, and James Skelton all living in Hawkins County, Tennessee in 1834, probably from the late 1700s. So the next clue to who William was and where he came from, we have to go back to Essex County, Virginia, which is right next door to Caroline County, in May of 1750. And if you go back to May of 1750, in Essex County Order Book, there's a apprentice indenture between James Skelton and Richard Coleman. Remember, I told you, remember that name Coleman. So this was Richard Coleman. William served under Samuel Coleman, who was actually paid by Samuel Coleman. So Richard Coleman was the uncle, so 1 generation higher than the Samuel Coleman that paid his wages. So James Skelton in 1750 was apprenticed to be a carpenter under Richard Coleman. And this indenture describes James as the orphan of William Skelton, deceased. So we know that at that point, at least in 1750, William Skelton was deceased. Probably died 1749-ish, 1750. And also in this indenture, it says James was 15 years old. So that means he was born in 1735. This is a 1750 indenture. If he's 15 years old, quick math will tell you that 1735 is when he was born. Um, so that's critical. So if we go a little bit further into the math weeds, if that James Skelton was the father of William, and we know when William was born in 1762, and we know that James was born in 1735, then that would make James about 30 years old when John was born in 1765. 27 years old in 1762. So the dates work great for James to be the father of William and John when he was 27 and 30 years old. Works perfectly. But there are a couple more clues. And let's go back to that deposition or that application that William made in Hawkins County. And I'm going to pull it up real quick. When I'm editing this video, I'll try to, if I remember right, I will put this in there. But there's a clue in that Revolutionary War application that is super easy to overlook. I overlooked it. I probably read that application 3, 4, 5, 6 times. And I overlooked it for various reasons. Sometimes it's just hard to read this stuff. I mean, you're looking at 15 generations of copies of something that was old when it was copied the first time. The writing is tough to read sometimes, and sometimes they just use phrases and words, back then that we don't use nowadays. So it's a little bit tough to, in some degrees, it's like almost learning a second language. But there is something in here, and I want to read it to you because it's important that I get this right. Age of 71 years old last March, because this was done in April or May, when he, William, appears from the record of his father's farm by now in his possession. So we know then that William was living on a farm that used to belong to his father. So that's a big clue. Now he doesn't say who his father is or what his name was or anything like that. But the fact that we know William had a brother named John and a brother named James, and that William now lived, because we know where William lived. He lived on about 280 acres in the Grassy Creek area in Hawkins County, Tennessee. And then the next clue, I want to find this. Well, this is William Skelton's will, where he talks about his brother James Skelton, grandson William Skelton, brother James Skelton. That's a big deal. So again, we have 3 brothers, William, James, John, all living in Tennessee, Hawkins County, and they were the son of somebody who already lived there too. So now the next clue as to who their father was, I am looking now at an 1834 will of James Skelton, the brother of John and William. This is a will in 1834. So he was a certain. You don't start making wills when you're in your probably 20s and 30s. You're a little bit more advanced, or a little bit farther along in life. And this is another one. I read this thing a dozen times before I happened to see this one word and just noticed this one word. And again, when I'm editing this video, I'll put it up here so you can see it. But it says, "Know by all men, by these present, that I, James Skelton, of the county of Hawkins, state of Tennessee," yada, yada, yada. Well, there's a word after his name that I overlooked several times. But that's an important word. The word is J-U-N-R. And that is how they always spelled junior. So in 1834, it says that I know by all men these present that I, James Skelton, Jr., of the county of Hawkins. So that means that obviously his father was James Skelton Sr. And then that is the James Skelton, because you remember William served under Coleman. They were back from Caroline County. James, the apprentice, was right next to Caroline County. And so, in my mind, this is indisputable evidence that William, John, and James, their father was James Skelton, And if you follow that line back to where they say they were born, 70 years earlier, to Caroline County, and the only other Skelton down there is that James Skelton, who was the apprentice of a William Skelton. So now you know their father is James Skelton, and you know their grandfather is William Skelton. That's how those two words make a difference, or I guess more than two words, but that word junior, which is easy to overlook, I did it several times, is incredibly critical. And then his Revolutionary War application, where he talks about on his father's farm, and we know that his brothers were James, William, and John. So the Williams, so now we have them, we have their father James, we know their grandfather is William. So who is that William that died in 1750-ish, back in Essex County or Caroline County? That, and that's a little bit much for this video, I've probably gone into way too much detail anyway, but that William Skelton then is the son of the immigrant John Skelton, who was in Surrey and Isle of Wight counties in the 1660s. He came over as a headwright in the 1660s, ended up having quite a bit of success, but died in the James River in 1704. So all of this, when you compile all this information and you start putting it together, then the only realistic conclusion in my mind is that William Skelton, Father James Skelton, Father William Skelton, or Grandfather William Skelton, great-grandfather John Skelton, the immigrant. Now, as far as who followed after William, we know from his will that he had a grandson named William Christian, and from other documents, again, a little bit too much for this video here, we know that William's daughter was Nancy Skelton, who then married that other Christian. That was their name, not their religion. I don't know who William's wife was. I haven't been able to figure that out. May never be able to figure it out. But the Skelton and Christians in Hawkins County they're inseparable. You basically can't throw a stick without hitting a Skelton or a Christian. And there's a good chance that they're married or cousins or uncle, niece, nephew, aunt, something like that. And they eventually migrated down to the Midwest. I think there are just tons of them down in Missouri, Arkansas area. But again, so there you go. That's the first profile of Skeltons in the Revolutionary War. There are more, like I said, and my plan is to do more. But I will tell you what, researching this, putting it all together, being able to cite my sources, putting that all together, writing the script or the outline, doing this video right here, and then doing the editing that's going to come after this video, that's just a crap ton of work. I'd like to think I'll do 5 or 6 more of these. I probably won't. Let's be honest with you. I'm just being honest with myself here. But there are a couple I'd like to do. There's another William Skelton from Charlotte County that I'd like to do. That one's an interesting one, I think. And then there's my 4 times great-grandfather, Mark Skelton, that is credited with being a Revolutionary War patriot. I'm not so sure about that. There's your season-ending cliffhanger right there. Anyway, hope you found this helpful. Again, I'm not a professional at any of this stuff. This is just my house. I don't have a studio with fancy lights and a microphone and all the stuff going on. But it's just our house here in Las Vegas. Oh, in case you're wondering, this is Skelton Truck Lines. I got this. This Skelton Truck Lines is based out of Canada. I want to say Toronto. I could be wrong on that. I got this from them, directly from them. I haven't figured out any kind of connection to my line of Skeltons. I suspect if we go back far enough, we all are. But I haven't found any connection yet. Maybe there is one. If you know, comment. Have a good one.